Okay, so good morning, everyone. This part of the presentation is a contribution from the Supplier Development Programme, which you've obviously all registered for in order to attend the webinar. So the aim here really is to just give you a kind of selection, if you like, of some of the guidance that would normally be available through the SDP training programmes. So we're just going to run through, excuse me, probably three elements that I think from this FLS tender and some of the more recent ones have introduced requirements for suppliers that are probably slightly different to what might have been required in the past. So this is really why we've chosen the areas that we're looking at here. I'm going to start with sustainability, which covers both environmental, community benefits and some wider elements. A brief discussion on pricing. I think Lauren's already given you quite a bit, and there's plenty in the documents. We're going to talk a bit about contract management in the sense of how do you make that work for you as a supplier, but also for FLS. And I'm going to finish very quickly on some general tender tips at the end of the presentation. So starting with sustainability, it's a term that's very widely used now in the public sector. And I think we're a small business, so a bit like you, we have to bid for all the work that we get. And certainly over the last few years, sustainability and a number of other areas has become a much more demanding area, and this is very policy driven, and it's all to do with particularly for Scotland to become a net zero society. And you'll see increasingly, if you're bidding for other work, that this is an area where there's more and more questions. There's marks, so if you don't get the scores, you don't go through. So it's not a kind of add-on in the way that it used to be, where you could just tick a box to say, yes, I've got an environmental policy. So we're going to take a look at some of the key areas here. So net zero, some of you may be more than fully aware of this, but it is possibly worthwhile just to link into that link here at the top, just to see what the priorities are for the Scottish Government, because that then applies to all of the public sector, including FLS. There's a spend of about £12 billion per annum in procured services, goods and works by the Scottish Government effectively. And really on that basis, they expect to get a return from us as suppliers in terms of the environmental performance. So carbon emissions is a very strong area at the moment for net zero. There's some examples here which may or may not apply, but certainly maybe on-site power generation could apply. Electric transport, possibly not so much for your areas. Buildings, I guess for all of you, you may have a sort of office where you could be looking at that. And there's innovation in areas of carbon storage, capture and storage, which a number of companies are looking at now to make a difference. So in the orange text here are the requirements for this tender, for particularly the environmental and sustainability side. So just looking at those kind of individually, I think that the deal here is not to make general confirmations that we have a policy, we believe type statements, which people sometimes put in response to this question. It really is, under the supplier response here, what's required is evidence and a plan rather than just a policy. So for each of the questions here, you really do need to sit down and think, well, what actions are we going to put in place? There is a time scale, so it's a 5-year contract, so not everything has to happen in year one necessarily, but you have to show progression over the period of the contract as you get more resources or tools to help make things happen. Who's responsible? Again, I appreciate some of you will be potentially quite small businesses. So again, you still need to say who it is in the team that's going to drive this, to measure, to report results, and so on. I would highly recommend that you start to look for some external advisors. We've got some slides later which tell you where you can look for that, and it doesn't necessarily come at a cost. You will have to really indicate how you're planning to measure the progress. Now, in this particular contract, there is a monthly requirement, as Lauren said, for your emissions tracking. So already you need to be saying, well, what do we need to do? Who's doing this? What tools do we have that we can put into the tender to evidence? Okay, it might not be ready as of tomorrow, but do you have a plan in place that you can really make sure there's something in place that's acceptable to deliver that requirement? It's obviously going to be reported as part of your contract management. And as I say, provide a plan rather than this kind of shopping list idea, but also bottom line is you do still have to be proportionate to the size of your organization. Aside from doing the training with SDP, we spend a lot of time with small businesses, and I'm always quite amazed at how well they perform in some areas of innovation and ambition in terms of, I don't know, just improving the processes, but particularly again here in the sustainability area, because small businesses can react more quickly. So don't be afraid that, okay, if you don't have ideas in place, that you can still project and commit to doing things throughout the contract that introduce an innovative aspect for this area. In terms of environmental measures, there are areas here which I think probably many of you are doing already, possibly not measuring. So obviously and reporting, that's where the difference is. Recycling, reducing, there's what they call the circular economy. We're doing work with an IT company recently who describe how they take back equipment and disassemble it and then reassemble it to reuse. So they're no longer just throwing out stuff that doesn't work. And again, for many of you, that could apply, maybe not to major equipment, but components, some of your tool sets, office equipment, all that sort of area. There's things you can do to reduce your energy in the office. And obviously, this is a bit of a difficult discussion in the current fuel pricing environment, I have to say. But just certainly minimising fuel use, staff training for that sort of area. Other areas are perhaps more on-site. So what are you doing to make sure that you're not disposing of hazardous materials on site? And site waste management plans. Again, particularly we do a lot of work in construction, and this is now a mandatory requirement for many construction projects. You could evidence training for staff on environmental good practice. That might not be that you have all the training materials in-house, but you use, again, one of the agencies like Zero Waste Scotland. They're putting out a huge number of webinars, a bit like this one, and that could be quite a valid training activity for some of your team to talk through those and work out how to apply the advice on your business. The performance monitoring kind of crosses over now with contract management. So you will be expected to be doing that on site. So it's not just the technical performance, but what the environmental impact is on site. And I understand, I think Lauren will maybe correct me later, but I do understand that FLS will be doing more contract management in situ as well. You will all be procuring goods yourself, so not just equipment, but all sorts of other supplies. And under sustainability, I would be expecting to see that you have some form of supplier approval, that you can evidence really that the people you deal with are also concerned about environmental issues. You have KPIs to report on, so all this is a general advice here. Clearly that's part of your contract. And you do have a duty, obviously, to monitor your legal compliance. And again, that's where you need to depend on some of these external bodies to assist with that. The carbon measurement, I've put in some links here. Some of the issues in carbon measuring to relate. So either you'll find some tools, but they might be very household related. Otherwise, you might find tools where you're actually having to pay for the service. We've seen a huge increase in adverts for this type of tool and facility, so you do have to be a little bit careful, I think, not to jump in. I saw one this morning that was, I think, £1,200 a year, another one that was 270 that might actually do the job. So I put the link in for Zero Waste Scotland at the bottom there, because I think you should approach them perhaps first to see what they can offer by way of assistance. So sustainability is not just environmental efficiency. We've talked a little bit about your supply chain and how you source your materials. That can be an environmental element, but it has to also be how you pay your supply chain. So in a public contract within 30 days, how you source your material to make sure that it's not, I was thinking maybe workwear, for example. Do you know that the companies don't produce that in factories in Asia, for example? And most suppliers cover this in their website. So it's possible, and it is your responsibility really, if you're buying in these goods, to just make sure that they can evidence good practice down the supply chain. You can look at supporting the third sector. Shelter business is maybe not so applicable here, but third sector could be that you deal with a social enterprise or a charity to provide a certain service or goods for you. You have an overall duty for diversity and inclusion. Again, just referring back to construction, we do a lot of work there where particularly maybe some of the trades companies are very keen to get more female engineers or operatives involved. I'm probably making an assumption, but I'm guessing, I know one of our clients does some similar work here, or maybe more track building, but they have a female operative, but that seems to be quite unusual. So areas there in terms of diversity should be looked at, and also that you're training and providing development for your team. And again, that doesn't necessarily need to mean external courses. There will be certain required training that you have to do, clearly, in health and safety, but there are many, many resources available where you can get webinars and materials to help you with that. SDP are a source, by the way, as well. So if you check out their resources and their courses as well. And adopting innovative technology, I think Lauren's already referenced the harvesting equipment, where there's a huge amount of technology in the background to measure, obviously, quantities and so on. Other areas might be apps that help with just other aspects of your business that you can use and just say, look, we're doing this now, as opposed to what manually would have taken more time, less accurate, and so on. So that's a very quick overview really of the sustainability things to think about. The community benefits, you have 2 mandatory benefits, which Lauren has covered already. Employment, again, so 1 new entrant. For different suppliers, this might be a different type of person that you're looking to take on. But if the work at this point under contract is now actually measurable as to what you're going to get, you're in a better position then to actually commit to saying what sort of vacancies that you might have now to fill in. I would, again, just recommend that you make sure that you take use of the local employability services, not just for advertising, but also for help with recruiting and filtering and so on. And community engagement, again, there's an example here, so notifying when the work will impact access. But just looking at some of the other examples, there are quite a few other areas where, particularly from a community point of view, you can provide added value. Your staff might be able to volunteer within communities. You might have people not necessarily on-site staff, but people in the office who have skills in finance, marketing, whatever, that a small community group or a charity, for example, would be very grateful to have a commitment for so many hours. Within your supply chain, obviously, community benefits would expect you to be looking to subcontract to local businesses where possible. And again, perhaps within that, social enterprises or charities, if that's relevant. Community enhancement can help. So if you have equipment and the skills, it could be that there's areas where you could make a commitment really to go in and undertake a sort of one-off improvement project on behalf of the communities where you're working. I appreciate this is a national contract, so it would be clearly in the areas where you're based and where you're working. And then just in general, I guess there's what we call outreach and education. Sometimes people do this through schools as well. So they'll go in to do a schools careers event and offer the chance to really say, kind of, people probably don't know, it's a strange thing to say, but a lot of people in schools or even college students don't actually know the jobs that are out there. So some sort of presentation or attending an event to say, like, here's the career, here's the routes, and here's what might be interesting. And possibly within that, you could offer some form of work experience. Again, in your on-site work, that's probably quite difficult, I think, for health and safety reasons, but perhaps even in the office. For this tender, you'll have to think carefully, not just about saying, here's a wish list of things that I want to do or we want to do, but you do need to put together a proper method statement. So here, you need to read, obviously, the tender guidance in full and make sure that what's been asked for, particularly in the scoring areas of community benefits that you're covering. And again, I think it's in the tender, Lauren's mentioned this, you need to focus on what you can offer for this contract. We've reviewed quite a few tenders in the past where people have just given a list of what they've done so far. And quite often it might be just like supporting the football team with strips or da-da-da. But you don't get points for that. You can use your previous experience to say, we've done this in the past and this is how we're going to do it again, so we know the process. But you can't rely on what you've done so far to win the points in these questions. You should be looking to work in close collaboration with anybody in the FLS team that deals with community benefits, but you will also have quite a number of local organisations, regardless of where you're bidding nationally, who can help. So employability services, so things like Job Centre Plus, CITB is construction, but they might cover some of your areas. Skills Development Scotland, who do all the kind of careers events and advice and so on, or just linking in with individual schools and colleges. So the more you can reference that in your method statement specific to your area, the stronger your response will be. And again, your plan should show not just a kind of list of things. You need to say year 1, 2, and so on up to year 5, what you think you can commit to in terms of community benefits and what the activities will be. And then, as you know, you have to report regularly through the contract management on your activities in relation to this. Quite often it's good to have somebody in the organisation that takes particular responsibility for community benefits. I have seen, even in larger organisations, it kind of falls a little bit between people. So nobody actually has the responsibility to make sure these things happen. So on to contract management. Again, I think it is quite a strong requirement now for FLS in the current contracts that are being procured to make sure that contract management is done in a more kind of productive and collaborative way. Mark talked a little bit in his presentation about this, and I think that's, in my experience, that's very positive. We see a lot of contracts where people win the contract and the contract management, despite the fact you've said what you're going to do and the tender's been very specific, in reality, there's not much goes on once the contract starts. So I think this is a very positive move now, but obviously as suppliers, we can be a bit daunted in that it feels like a lot of extra requirements on us. So broadly speaking, there are 3 areas now, and this, a bit like some of the other areas in sustainability and so on, this is actually a separate SDP course if anyone's interested. We've just picked out a few slides here. So you're looking at contract management in terms of your service delivery, and that really is the main kind of nuts and bolts, obviously, of the whole harvesting operation, from getting the request in to reacting to that, the kind of process, the site schedule that Mark referenced, for example, is going to be absolutely critical to contract management here. And then obviously tracking versus deadlines, so meeting budgets, meeting time, meeting KPIs, all of that aspect of doing the work, and obviously your ability as an organisation to make sure that you've got people on the ground and sufficient resources and so on. So there's a huge amount bound up in contract management in relation to service delivery, and that's where the more plans you've got, the more kind of schedules you're working to, so it's not just kind of a quick phone call and a bit random. So the planning process and evidence that you can produce, obviously, to show how that's happening on site is very important. Aside from that, the relationship management aspect is also very important. We've got a few slides coming up that talk a bit about that. And the third aspect is the contract administration. And again, sometimes this is part of your KPIs. You need to be sure what reports you have to produce and get them in on time. You need to get your invoicing in on time and accurate. And you need to have systems to make sure that you're capturing the information that you need for administration. And that, just maybe going back to some of those innovative and technology solutions, there are lots of apps now that maybe some of you are using. Things like, well, Sage has been around for a while, things like Xero for your invoicing, various other systems that do workflow tracking and so on. So anything there that you've got in the background, I would make sure to mention in your tender. So going back to the relationship side of the contract management, I think just looking, this is a kind of generic slide, obviously, from the training courses from SDP, but I think quite a lot of these elements apply. This first bullet point is interesting because it says the extent to which you as the provider is involved in any internal planning or other activities. Now, that site schedule process to me is a very important indicator that you will get a chance to discuss for each site schedule what the issues are. And as Mark said, that's a collaborative process. So it's not that you'll be able to go and say, right, here's how we think it's going to be done. It'll be a two-way process, but it is a process. And in many other contracts that I've seen, that's possibly not even available. You need to do an assessment from time to time to see how well that's working, and particularly the management structures, the different people involved, how that's working, and check that the information that you have is being sort of freely and openly shared between the parties. Resolving conflicts is very important, and you need to have a process for that, which we'll look at shortly. And, do you have feedback channels? Because again, probably in the trade sort of work that we do, there's quite often a situation where the people on the ground know that things aren't working very well. And it's maybe not the supplier's fault, it's maybe the buyer, the employer, so to speak, who's not giving enough information, but it's sort of causing a bottleneck, but somehow it doesn't make its way back to the relevant person to make sure that that gets changed. So these are the sort of areas where in your tender, and for example, you'd want to be looking at how you would make sure that you've got that kind of oversight to escalate things through. Financial measurement systems and performance measurement systems. Ideally, it's good if they're accessible to both parties. I think just looking at the pricing, which we'll cover shortly, that's pretty transparent, the way that that's organised. So I suspect the financial side will be pretty open. So then it's more the performance side. So not just the KPIs, but what's the kind of day-to-day reporting that goes on and the dialogue, so that both parties are aware of what's going on at any one time. And obviously the monitoring information, sometimes that comes from both sides. So there's quite an onus on the suppliers in this contract, clearly, to supply information. But you want to know from your side how that's being used by FLS and what happens next. So that's part of a two-way dialogue as well. Communications, again, this on our sort of training course here, this really underpins many things, and I think it's part of what we've talked about in the previous slide. It's really a case of making sure that you've got the right people in place, but that the communications line is feeding back any issues, and good issues, by the way, as well. That's the other thing not to forget. So where you've had a success or you've had a good community discussion, something like that, make sure that that feeds through, that it's not just sometimes you're asked to do management by exception, which means people only want to know the bad things. I'm a great believer in making sure that the good aspects are reported through as well. Dealing with problems promptly, I think that's fairly obvious for most of us. But if people are busy and it's the sort of thing that's maybe doesn't seem to be a big issue at the time, there can be situations where things move on and it suddenly becomes an escalation process if it's not dealt with properly. I'm trying to think of sort of a good example for the FLS contract, but it could maybe be related to your community relations. So there's a bit of a niggle going on. It's not quite, it might just be one or two people that have objected to something. It's maybe not come to much yet, but you need to deal with it properly and obviously make sure that the client's aware of that as well. It is important for any problems that they're recorded. I'm thinking again of some of our trades and construction type clients, and they work to a sort of daily job sheet arrangement, or sometimes they're using a PDA, a sort of electronic system, to kind of clock in every day. And they would always make sure that things are recorded at the start through those sort of systems. And as we said, make sure that the buyer's notified by an appropriate route, and also at an appropriate level, because that could be an issue sometimes. So you might have reported something through and it's not made its way through, if you like, through on the buyer's side. So escalation procedures, important. We've got a slide coming up on that shortly. Managing expectations, I think, is a very important element, but this is the kind of grey area, I think, of contract management, and it's quite a fine balance, and it depends on the experience of the people involved. there is a situation where you do have to be able to say at a certain point if something is unrealistic or unachievable, then it's not, in terms of sustainability, if you like, for your business, it's not good enough really just to sort of say, right, that's okay, we can do everything, because it's a bit like handling the problem. It just saves an issue up for longer down the line. So if you have a good relationship with the contract managers, you should be comfortable to be able to say, we need to push back on this, here are the reasons. And again, I'm just going back really to that site schedule. I think that is the area and the process where you will have leeway to be able to say, on this site, in this particular area, here's what we think could be some issues, and you can have an open dialogue. You need to make sure, from a contract management point of view, you've got the right people with the interpersonal and management skills, if you like, to manage the contracts. Now, as I say, this is maybe not specific just to FLS, because I think everybody works quite closely already with the organisation, but it's certainly an issue in some contracts where possibly somebody has put in and they're kind of really reporting at the wrong level to the wrong people, and that can lead to all sorts of issues with contract management. So clear roles and responsibilities defined. You should do that in your tender and also reinforce it at the startup meeting. Continuity of key personnel is absolutely essential where you can do that. Quite often seen people putting in tenders where everything depends on a contract manager, but they haven't designated a deputy manager. So you need to have a look at that and make sure that you've got backup personnel for key positions. KPIs, again, this is a general recommendation in the contract management training, but as you have those under FLS already provided, and I think you have a quarterly review for those. So again, in your tender, you need to just evidence what will you do to make sure those are done, who's going to do it, and up to that quarterly review, what's the kind of timings of how you're going to be measuring those and recording them and making sure, particularly for continuous improvement, if there, what mechanism have you got, like an alert to say this one's slipping? I've seen some companies use a red, amber, green assessment so that the people on site can say, on this basis, we're maybe amber, so we think there might be issues that we're going to slip down. So somebody can actually react to that and not wait for the quarterly review to sort it out. So part of that assessment for KPIs involves risk. So this is not just necessarily health and safety risks. This is much more risks to the project. So there are two stages. You need to do the initial risk identification, and that again is part of contract management and delivery. And then once the contract starts, you need to be updating those and have a look and see, well, what are the key things that could go wrong here? I don't have any detailed slides on that just for this short presentation, but risk assessments for the project level could be supply chain issues, so equipment not being delivered, components, parts, I think is quite critical at the moment for lots of people. Fuel potentially could be an issue. Staffing, so during COVID, for example, that was certainly brought to the fore, and people just had to have very strong systems to make sure that they had good staffing arrangements if they had lots of key people off at any one time. So the risk needs to be identified basically at a level where you can sort of relate to it sort of in terms of this actual contract. So, it's not just that things are a general risk. What is the impact, high, medium, low, on this actual contract? And then once it's been identified, who's the owner who's going to make sure that that's managed and monitored over time? And then generally we would recommend that you have a risk register So that's usually a spreadsheet, and that's your template where you register any activities to update the management of any risks. Business continuity, so that's quite closely related to some of the things that we've just been talking about. Again, we've handled quite a few companies over the last 13 years that we've been working. Business continuity plans didn't exist at the beginning. Nobody seemed to have one. But even nowadays, we quite often come across quite large organisations that don't really have a proper business continuity plan. And it's crucial. And it's back to that relationship with FLS so that they have trust in you, that you've got arrangements in place. It can be for personnel, obviously, is quite a critical system. Supply chain again. What would you do if one of the vehicles broke down? What's your planned cover for that? What could you do if some of your office systems, I don't know, there's a power cut or a fire, and so on. So again, you'll find resources through SDP for examples, I think, of business continuity plans. I think Business Gateway does a very good one as well. So that should be something to think about again for your contract management approach. And then change. So again, contract management. For a 5-year contract, things are going to change. So you need to look at things to do with, say, maybe your performance metrics. So a dialogue in place just to say, well, initially that looked realistic. It could be improved, or it's either no longer relevant. So those discussions, again, probably through your quarterly reviews, I think would take place. Changes to service functionality, these might be, excuse me, a bit more the day-to-day change, where you're trying to manage literally the nuts and bolts of the harvesting operations. And again, ongoing dialogue is important, but it needs to be logged, and it's not based on a sort of hearsay, oh, well, so-and-so said it was okay to do this differently. So it has to be quite a managed process. And similarly, changes to the service infrastructure. So again, probably that shouldn't make a big difference. It might mean, I don't know, a change of office, for example, if that shouldn't really have a big impact on what you're delivering. But changes to your equipment, for example, certainly would. And then changes to workload. So again, through that, the site schedule process, that would be handled. I think managing change, again, I think that just really applies to the dialogue through the site scheduling process as well, would give you a good basis for that. Quality management is important. So you're not required to have a formal ISO standard, but you do need to have elements in place so that you can evidence a quality management system. So you might have a policy, for example, but you should absolutely have these quality controls and checks. So at each stage of the works, again, we normally present this as a kind of table or a matrix. So at order stage, what do you do to make sure it's processed properly? Where do you log it? Who's responsible? What do you do if it doesn't go through properly, or if there's a mistake? And then through materials, workmanship, and so on, work your way through all the aspects and include any subcontractor activities as well. KPIs we've covered. You need to have a complaints procedure written down. You should have a supplier approval process, and you should have evidence, if you can, of staff briefings or training for what I would call quality discussions and training. So performance, quality standards, your staff need to know what the KPIs are, for example, in the contract. And you or your sort of senior team need to be looking at quality audits on site for workmanship, sort of standard of the work done. You may do toolbox talks for the training as well, and obviously you'd want to have some regular meetings with the client. That will come part of your quarterly review. Sustainable pricing is the next topic. It's an area, again, it's very much public sector policy driven here, where public sector buyers want to move away from this kind of race to the bottom if they can, where people are sort of pricing low and then come in and add in sort of extras along the way. So the bottom line is the client still ends up paying quite a lot, but somehow it's been skewed with a low price to begin with. It's very different to dealing with the commercial sector. So the public sector needs to be able to compare your tendered price with somebody else's. And that's where the difficulties arise. So you can't negotiate kind of on the hoof. You need to come up with your price. And obviously that needs to be an inclusive price, as Lauren's described in her slides previously as well. And that particularly is of interest to the public sector. So they don't want a super low price that means people get paid below either living wage, certainly clearly not below the national minimum wage. They don't want a cheap price that means that working conditions are dreadful, that staff don't get trained. So they want prices that reflect this fair work practice. Your price needs to take into account achieving net zero, because obviously that may come at a cost, although some environmental improvements can make your service delivery cheaper. It's not necessarily an add-on cost, but it also, as well, you need to consider what they call whole life pricing. So for certain types of assets, there might be a cost of disposal. It might be that you're looking at recycling options, that you get some sort of money back from those for certain materials and so on. But it's certainly, you need to also look at the costs of active contract management and consider the time that will be put into that. So the FLS pricing model is very interesting. Obviously, you're asked to be, include costs. I think welfare is an area where maybe previously that wasn't provided 100%. It will have to be now. There's haulage, staff transport, and so on. The cost drivers make it very clear what the basis of the annual price reviews will be. As I say, this is quite interesting. That's an area where it's quite unusual to have this presented so that it's so clear to bidders how these price rises will be. And interesting again as well that there's different indices for the different price drivers to the cost drivers. So you'll see I've made reference, and I think Lauren did to this document, to the evaluation and award criteria. So they've given an example here just to show you how that works. So please make sure you read that document. Okay, I'm just going to finish up with a couple of slides on some of the more general tips to make sure that you can maximise your score on the tender writing. First of all, and I know this sounds very obvious, but please read all the buyer attachment documents before you start. We've just had a look at that evaluation document, and it has got absolutely crucial information on how the different elements will be scored, including the pricing. So that for sure will give you a good guidance on how the approach will be. Quite often I would download a copy of the questionnaire. So when you go into PCS tender, at the top of the form, when you first go in, there's a little icon with 3 dots. And that lets you produce a printable version of the whole questionnaire. And I find that sometimes quite useful, so you can actually look at it. I suspect it's not very environmentally friendly, I'm afraid, because it might have a few pages, but it does help you make sure that you've literally read through absolutely everything, because sometimes working on the screen on PCS tender is not so clear. When it comes to a scored question, you really need to plan your response before you start writing. Look at all the guidance, make a note when you're going through the specification, for example, of things that you think you need to include in each answer. I do this handwritten, to be honest, quite a lot of the time, and I just have a page per question. As I'm going through the different documents, I add in a note saying, make sure you talk about this, reference that. You can do it as bullet points. And I think that helps quite strongly to make sure that A, you answer the questions, but B, you show FLS that you really have read their documents and you're not just giving them a general cut and paste answer to things. And it also helps you double check that you've, for example, it might be 2 or 3 points that they've asked for in a question. So a plan will help you make sure that you don't just cover 2 and then forget about number 3. And that's the sort of thing that happens all the time when people are kind of losing marks. For any uploaded documents, if there is a word or a page limit, and I think there are some font size recommendations in the guidance, so please make sure you keep to those. And try and use, if you've got an answer that might be quite long, try and use subheadings in the text to show the evaluators as they go through that you're answering every point. Use tables. If it's a Word document for uploading, you can. Bullet points are okay, as long as they're not too kind of general, not used in place of a longer text that would be more valuable. Try not to be too daunted by the questionnaire and the form, because the bottom line, I know there's quite a few method statements, for example, I think, where you have to clarify, you know, your approach in terms of certain ways of working for the harvesting. It's really a case of, you know, what do you do in practice on a day-to-day? So tell the story. Don't assume, oh, it's just what we do kind of thing. Don't assume, oh, FLS know this already, so we don't need to write it. So yeah, get it down and just say, right, start to finish, what's the detail? And if it has to be some bullet points to make sure you can fit it in, that's fine. So just don't be too concise. That's a very common issue. And I know FLS have raised that a couple of times where people just give an answer, but it's not enough, really. It just doesn't merit the full score. The opposite of that is what I've called here waffly details. Sometimes we will look at tender answers and say, oh, we're high quality and everything we do is fantastic and we're well known and we're high value and da da da, and it's really all opinion. So to get the score, you can still say we offer a high quality response or service, but you've got to say what the basis of that is. What's your evidence for that? So just make sure that you're not putting in too much of the blah blah, as we might call it. Don't cross-refer to other responses instead of answering the question, because that won't get you any points, unfortunately. And don't include any web links, because the evaluation team won't be looking at anything outside of the tender document. So just as a final slide, I've just put in some of the sources of help. There is the Supplier Journey, which is a Scottish Government site, which gives good guidance to bidders on how to submit your tenders. Healthy Working Lives cover health and safety questions, which was not particularly covered in this issue. And the HSE, again, have fantastic templates, guidance on risk assessments, HS health and safety policies. Zero waste, in particular, I think for this tender is going to be very important for you, particularly with the sustainability and environmental aspects. And there's a link there for the Living Wage Foundation. Fair Work First is available if you're not too sure from the tender documents what the requirements are for that. And then the Supplier Development Programme, SDP Scotland. So I think Elizabeth's probably already mentioned there's courses on all aspects of tendering. They're all free of charge. You're already registered clearly for this event. So if there were anything, maybe not in time for this tender, but going forward, I would certainly encourage you to dig a bit deeper on the tender training. And that's me, Elizabeth. We're done.